1 Samuel 22. Now, as we mentioned last week, chapters 21 and 22 really form a unit. And this is telling the story of David fleeing, and he goes to Nob, and he speaks to the priest Ahimelech there. And while he is with Ahimelech, Ahimelech gives him the bread, the table of showbread, and he gives him the Goliath. And then he makes his way down to Gath, and he's kind of hiding out there. And, of course, he's fleeing from King Saul. And that was chapter 21, and that directly leads us into chapter 22, and it picks up right where it left off. And so it says in verse 1, David therefore departed thence, and that's speaking from Gath. He departed thence and escaped to the cave Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. And David went thence to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, Let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be. And he brought them forth before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the hold. And the prophet Gad said unto David, Abide not in the hold, depart and get thee into the land of Judah. And he came into the forest of Hareth. And when Saul heard that David was discovered, and how the men that were with him, and it says, Now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. And then Saul said unto his servants that stood about him, Hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? And there is none that showeth me that my son hath made league with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you that is sorry for me, or showeth unto me that my son hath stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as at this day. And then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse come into Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and he gave him victuals, and he gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. And then the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests that were in Nob, and they came all of them to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, thou son of Ahitub. And he answered, Here I am, my lord. And Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, and that thou hast given him bread, sword, and hast inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait, as at this day? And then Ahimelech answered the king, and he said, Who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thine house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor unto the house of my father, for thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. And the king said, Thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house. And the king said unto the footmen that stood about him, Turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand is also with David, and because they knew when he fled, and did not show it to me. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, Turn thou and fall upon them. He slew on that day 75 persons that did wear a linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and sucklings, and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword. And one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar showed David that Saul had slain the Lord's priest. And David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. Abide thou with me, fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life, but with me thou shalt be in safeguard. And so, as David escaped the city of Gath, he makes his way to a cave, the Bible tells us, in the city of Adullam. Now, Adullam is about 10 miles southeast of Gath, and it is really a kind of a midway point, a halfway point between Gath and Bethlehem. Now, in the area, not just in that city, but in that area where Adullam is, there are a lot of caves in that area. And many of them, not just one, but there are several caves that are more than large enough to have several hundred people inside of it at the same time. And with that being said, the text does not tell us that all of these hundreds of people were in the same cave. It could be that they were in different caves. But even if they were in the same cave, there are many there that could easily house, as you could say, that many people at one time. And so this isn't an issue. Now somehow, and we're not told how, but somehow his household hears where he is. And so it says there in verse 1, it says, and when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. And so they hear, where David is, and they have an understanding at least of what he's doing. And so they go to David, and they're hiding with David in this cave as well. And perhaps they just thought, if Saul is so vehemently against David and wants him dead, what's to stop him from coming after his household? Right? But for whatever reason, they go to David, and they're staying with him. But then beyond that, it wasn't just his household. Interestingly enough, in verse 2, it shows us that a lot of people, those who were kind of downtrodden, those who were outcast, it says that those who were in distress, those who were dead, those who were discontented, more than likely these are not just kind of outcast people, but also those who were just fed up with Saul. They're tired of how he's ruling things. They're tired of the things that Saul is doing. And so they gather around David, and it says that David became a captain over them. And so this is very much a motley crew of people, but David here has you could say a small army of around 400 people, all looking to David as their new leader. Now, of course, this is a microcosm of what was to come for David, as David was to be the king of the whole nation. But now you can see he is maybe you could say a small letter K king over this small group. And this is a picture of what was to come. But now David, obviously at this point, he still has no idea what's going to take place. We can see by his words what he tells to the king of Moab, that he has faith that God's going to deliver him. Now, by this point, he's been anointed. Samuel has already told him that he's going to be the next king, and it seems as if David had a full faith and absolute confidence that if God said he was going to be king, he was going to be king, that Saul was not going to be successful in taking his life. But that doesn't mean he knows exactly what the road to being king looks like. Right? And so he doesn't understand all that, but he has at least an understanding that he's going to be king, and so he wants to give even more protection than what he in this cave can offer his parents. And so he goes to the king of Moab, and he tells the king of Moab, he says, let my father, my mother, I pray thee come forth and be with you till I know what God will do for me. Not till I know what God will do, but specifically till I know what God will do for me, right? And like I say, you can see the faith that David has in God. Now, we're not told why, but the king agrees to this, and it's perhaps, and again, this is just conjecture, but it is perhaps that David's great-grandmother was a Moabitess in Ruth, right? And so Ruth was from Moab, we know that. Probably most people from that particular area knew her genealogy, and so he could stand upon relation to the Moabites, and perhaps, again, this is just conjecture, but perhaps this is why the king allows his parents to stay. And then it says David was in the hold in verse 4, at the end of verse 4. Now that word hold there is in reference to a stronghold. It's not clear if that stronghold was in Moab or if that stronghold was in Adullam. It makes more sense to me that it was probably in Adullam, but nevertheless, David was in some kind of stronghold. And then verse 5, such a fascinating verse to me. Verse 5 kind of comes out of nowhere. It says, in the prophet Gad. We've never heard from this man before. We've never heard of these other prophets, right? We've really Samuel's the only one we've heard about. But it says, and the prophet Gad said unto David, abide not in the hold, depart and get thee into the land of Judah. And David listened. Then David departed and came to the forest of Hareth. And we'll see as we make our way further into Samuel that David brings this man Gad on to kind of be a prophet for David. And so he clearly trusts the word of this man. But this is, as I write here, this is a blink and you miss it moment in this particular chapter. There's a lot of things going on. David is kind of putting pieces where they need to be for protection and everything, and then kind of out of nowhere, this prophet, again, who we've never heard of, we don't know anything about this man, this prophet comes out of nowhere and prophesies to get to the land of Judah. You've got to get out of the stronghold, which might be the opposite of what one might think at this point in time. No, the king of Israel wants me dead. I think I'll stay in the stronghold. But the prophet says, no, you need to leave. And seemingly, here in verse 5, there's no hesitation on the part of David. Again, this seems to be complete faith by David in God and in his message, because the prophet tells him, get out of the stronghold, and David goes. David goes to the forest of Hareth. But this is, to me, this is another example in a long line of examples that we've had in the story of David already, a way in which God can help or get the message to the person he's trying to get the message to in any manner he deems best. Just a couple of days ago, that Saul was prophesying, that Saul's servants were prophesying even when they didn't want to. They were going to kill David, and then the Spirit overcomes them, and they begin to prophesy, and they couldn't even help it. And so God can help, God can move pieces in any way he sees fit. And we're going to see this even more so at the end of the chapter in a very unique way. But furthermore, and this is an interesting note here, it shouldn't be lost on us that David here receives unprompted words from a prophet. David didn't seek this man out. This guy goes to David with the message from God. And so David, without even seeking a prophet, gets a word from a prophet. And he's getting messages from God. He's being led by God. Whenever the Lord, we've seen twice back in chapter 18, the Lord had departed from Saul. And so God's giving no message to Saul. Saul has no man of God that's going to give him the words of God. And yet here, David, again, unprompted, is receiving messages from the Lord. Now, we know nothing. Like I said, we know nothing about this prophet. God just kind of pops into the scene. But God raised him to proclaim his truth, and he did so at what is a very crucial moment in David's life. Now, David wisely listens, and he goes to the forest of Hareth. But again, I like to think about these kinds of things where you have this prophet Gad, who, again, more than likely, and I can't say that dogmatically, but more than likely was studying under a school started by Samuel for prophets. Again, maybe not, but that's kind of the assumption. And so Gad is studying. He's allowing God to speak to him. He's learning how to properly be a prophet and properly proclaim the messages of God, and probably never expected to be used of God in such a manner, and yet lived faithfully to a degree where God chose him to be the one to go give the message to David, and now his name is forever enshrined in the pages of Scripture. And so it's just, I like to think about how God just orchestrates these events in ways that might seem minute to us, right? If we were to sit here and just read about the days in and days out of Gad the prophet, it might not be very fascinating. And yet this was the man that God chose to give this very important message to David. People everywhere were feeding him information, maybe even spies everywhere. We don't know. But Saul hears what's going on, and he hears about David. He hears about the men that are with him there in verse 6. And then he just starts lashing out at his servants. Again, we have to understand that Saul is absolutely paranoid at this point. He's being tormented by this evil spirit. He's extremely jealous, extremely bitter about the things that are happening with David. And so he just starts lashing out at his servant. He's accusing them of everything. You're in league with him. You didn't tell me what he was doing. You didn't tell me that Jonathan was in league with him. Jonathan is the one who set all this up. You should have told me about Jonathan. Right? And so he just starts lashing out and yelling at his servants. And then he says something that to me is very eye-opening. He says, there is none of you that is sorry for me. Right? I mean, imagine that in the midst of his anger, sitting on the throne as king, trying to kill innocent David, who has never wished harm upon Saul at all. He's sitting there yelling at his servants for doing things that they didn't do, and then in the middle of all that says, and none of you are sorry for me. I mean, this is the extreme pity party of Saul. He has, you hear this all the time. He is playing the victim when he's the one holding the javelin and has tried to kill David and his own son. Right? And so here he is trying to say that it's me, woe is me, and you should feel sorry for me. You should feel sorry for me. And so how dare you not be sorry for me? And so this is just as we've talked about, said this many times already, this is the descent into madness for Saul. And so he gets to the point where he can't see himself as anything but a victim of what? David? A victim of God? A victim of the system that he's in charge of? Right? What is he a victim of? He's not. But here he is trying to feel sorry for himself. Now, if they were actually silent, again, we have no evidence that his servants were actually trying to keep all this information from Saul. But if they were, Doeg wasn't. And this is the man that I mentioned last week. He's very briefly mentioned in chapter 21. And so in chapter 21, all it says in verse 7, now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg. Right? And so we just get this brief little note in chapter 21 that Doeg was there and witnessed David and Ahimelech. That's all we get in chapter 21. And I told you last week that he would come back to play a much bigger role in chapter 22. And so we see that here. And so then answered Doeg, verse 9, the Edomite, he said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, he being Ahimelech, he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him victuals and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. And so Doeg just tells Saul all that he saw there. And Saul's not going to stand for this. Again, Saul thinks himself to be the victim. Saul sees every action of David and anybody who's not on Saul's side as a direct action against himself. It doesn't matter if it's completely innocent. David just goes to get bread so he can survive. But in the mind of Saul, no, that's Ahimelech turning his back on me. Ahimelech was just feeding David and his men, but that was Ahimelech turning his back on me. That was a slight against me. And so Saul's not going to stand for this. And so he calls Ahimelech and all of his father's house. He calls everybody from all the priests who were in Nob to come to Gibeah. And so this, the events that take place here don't originally take place in Nob, and that's important for later. And so they come to Gibeah where Saul is, and Saul asks them then. He says, why have you conspired with David? And he says, to rise against me. You have everything is a conspiracy to Saul. Everything is a conspiracy against him. Again, even though he's the one in control of the nation, right? This is the madness. This is the confusion that is reigning in Saul's mind. And I actually like the way Ahimelech answers him. I think he does a great job of answering Saul. And so you see this in verse 14. He said, who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thine house? He says, did I then begin to inquire to God for him? He says, be it far from me. And he says at the end, he says, for the servant knew none of this, no less or more. And so essentially Ahimelech says, first of all, you're talking about David. Let's talk about David for a second. David is faithful. David is honorable. David has done everything you have ever asked him to do. And he says, beyond the fact, he's your son-in-law. So you're coming against your own family, someone who's been honorable to you, someone who's been faithful to you. He says, so first of all, why are you trying to kill him? He says, second of all, in verse 15, he said, did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Essentially, this is not the first time David has come to me. This is not the first time I've prayed to God for David. Essentially, here's what he's saying. I'm a priest, Saul. That's what I do. I pray to God when people come to me. I pray for them. And so he says, this isn't, don't sit there and act like this is the first time I've ever prayed for somebody, and it just so happens to be the person that you're against. Just think logically about this for a second. And so he tells them point blank, I don't know anything about what you're inquiring of. This is all news to me. And so he says, I know nothing of all this, less or more. And so there's no conspiracy. Ahimelech didn't, or his priest, nobody knew anything what was going on. They're not in Saul's palace. They're not in the house of the king. They don't know all the madness that Saul's been involved with. They don't know that he's tried to twice kill David and now wants his own son. They don't know any of this. And again, Ahimelech is just trying to appeal to logic here, which, of course, would work if someone were not going mad. Logic has gone out the window a long time ago for Saul. And so he's not working logically anymore. So, of course, this didn't work for Saul. And so at this point, Saul doesn't care for the truth anymore. Right? So the truth for Saul is firmly what he has made it. The truth for Saul at this point is it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what evidence you present. David is against me. David is conspiring against me. David wants me dead. And so I don't care what proof you present. If you talked to David, you are now against me, and you need to die. That's the only thing that Saul's operating on. So he commands his servants to slay the priests. But amazingly here, in verse 17, they actually stand up to Saul, his own servants. They refuse to do this. It says at the end of verse 17, but the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. All right, and so here Saul is just, he's so mad, he's so jealous, and he's lashing out at everybody that he calls his servants to just kill all these priests. and to their credit, stand up and say, no, we're not going to do it. We see the truth of this matter. And so either one of two things. Either they know that these priests are telling the truth and then they're innocent, or secondly, even if they don't know that for a fact, we're not taking arms against the priests. We're not going to do that. Now, we don't know what happens to these servants, but I would imagine nothing good. They have denied Saul what Saul wanted at this point. But we have this man, Doeg. And if his servants had these extreme reservations, Doeg does not. He does not have these reservations, and he goes on a murderous spree. And so verse 18, it says, the king said to Doeg, turn thou and fall upon the priest. And it says, and Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priest and slew on that day 85, but this is 85 priests that he kills at Gibeah. Okay, so this is why I said earlier that Saul calls them in verse 11 and 12, he calls them to him. He doesn't go to Nob. Saul calls Ahimelech and all the priests to come to Gibeah. And so in verse 18 there, Doeg kills all the priests that are there and then turns and goes to Nob. And so he doesn't stop there. It's not just one big moment where he just goes on a spree. No, he kills everybody in Gibeah and then makes his way to Nob to continue killing. And so he goes in verse 19, he goes to Nob, the city of the priests, and there it says he smote with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and sucklings and oxen and asses and sheep with the edge of the sword. And so he doesn't just stop with Ahimelech or the direct priest of Ahimelech. No, he goes to Nob where the tabernacle was and just kills everybody. It doesn't matter if they're even related to Ahimelech. It doesn't matter if they have anything to do with the goings-on of Saul and David or this event that took place at Nob. If you were in the way of Doeg at this particular event, man, woman, child, or animal, it didn't matter. He was just going to kill everything that breathed. And he goes on this just bloody, murderous spree. Now, this event becomes incredibly interesting, and that might not be the best word, but just hear me out for a minute. There's a lot of layers on this. And so first, let me quote David Firth here. He said, Saul is becoming a classical falling into the pattern against which Samuel warned. And so again, go back to chapter 8, and all the people are crying out for a king. And Samuel, God tells Samuel, listen, give them a king, because it's not you they have rejected, it's me. And Samuel gives them this long, lengthy speech there in chapter 8, and he says, if you want a king, fine. Here's what he's going to be like. And it was all bad. It was all bad. And here's some of the evidence of that. Right? This is what you wanted. This is what you asked for. You might not have thought this is what you asked for, but in essence, this is what you asked for. And so this is a fulfillment of Samuel's words to the people. But this is a fulfillment of a lot of things. Here we see a partial fulfillment way back in the chapter, or in the book, of what God prophesied to Eli. And so if you remember at the beginning of the book of Samuel, Eli and his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were these wicked men and doing all kinds of evil things as priests. Eli knows about this, and he doesn't stop them. He doesn't, it burdened him, but he didn't do anything about it. And so God gives a prophecy to Eli in chapter 2, verse 31, that he was going to cut off thine arm and the arm of thy father's house, that there shall not be an old man in thine house. Well, Ahimelech and all these priests are the descendants of Eli. And so Doeg here comes and in a murderous spree that is unjustified in any way, fulfills the prophecy, at least partially fulfills, because we see at the least that Abiathar survives, but partially fulfills the prophecy of God. He was going to cut off his house. I think that's fully, and I mentioned this back in chapter 2, I think it's fully fulfilled under Solomon. But here is a very near complete fulfillment with really one exception. And so there's a fulfillment of Samuel's words to the people. There's a fulfillment of God's prophecy to Eli. And then I want to quote Davis here because there's more to this, and even more that we'll talk about in a second. It is a horrid wickedness for which Saul and Doeg are fully responsible. It is a clear fulfillment of the word Yahweh had spoken. Put it together, and one truth becomes clear. Even in opposing God's kingdom, God's enemies only bring to pass God's word. In other words, Saul has Doeg go out and murder all these priests. God was not up in heaven thinking, oh no, that wasn't in the plan. That wasn't supposed to happen. Now I have no priests. What am I supposed to do? like I said, neither Saul nor Doeg was justified in their actions. It was completely sinful. They murdered these people. Even if Saul didn't pick up the sword, he commanded it to be done. Right? And so Saul and Doeg are fully 100% responsible for the death of these 85 in Gibeah, plus however many more in Nob. We're not told the number in Nob. But they're completely responsible for it. Add on top of that, the fact that this was God's fulfillment to Eli. And so we read a story like this and we think, well, how can the death of all of these innocent people be in the will of God? Well, that's a misnomer. They're not innocent people. They were sinners. They might have been innocent in this particular story, but that doesn't mean that they're innocent. They were still sinful. They were still sinners in need of judgment. And so God chose to use the sinful actions of Saul and Nob to bring righteous judgment against these priests that not only bring righteous judgment, at the same time fulfilling part of the prophecy of Samuel to the people. And then there's another element later on where we see that not only are Saul and Doeg responsible, but David is also partially responsible. And so what is so fascinating, like I said, it's interesting, and it's just because I can't think of a better word, but it's interesting how this one singular event is so layered, on one layer on top of other, and yet God sits over the whole thing as holy and just. And so we read this, and we might be horrified, and to be fair, yes, it's a horrifying situation. And it's a wicked situation. It truly is, because of the actions of Doeg here, particularly. But that doesn't mean it was outside of God's plan. And then we ask, well, was God unjust for this? No, because these were sinners. These were sinners in need of judgment. Right? And so if anybody reads through this and understand that this was God's doing, and take away from this that God was unjust, the only thing you're doing in that is placing humanity into a level of innocence that we do not belong. Amen. That's all you're doing. And so when we truly understand that people are sinners in need of judgment, well, then stories like this make a whole lot more sense. And so let's move forward, because like I said, there's another layer to add to this. And so verse 20, and one of the sons of Ahimelech, named Abiathar, escaped. We don't know how he escaped. Nobody else escaped. Everybody else died. Doeg was quite efficient, it seems. Whether he was hidden or whether or not, I don't know, maybe Doeg thought he was dead or something, but I don't know. But somehow or another, Abiathar escapes. He gets away. And so try as hard as he might to wipe out the priesthood. God did spare one son of Ahimelech, Abiathar, and he makes his way to David. Now Abiathar gets to David, and he tells David everything, right? Doeg came and killed everybody at Gibeah. He came to Nob, killed everybody there. I alone am escaped. And David's fear came true, because David saw Doeg at Nob, chapter 21. And so David said in verse 22, it said, David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul. And he says, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. Now why is this significant? Because in chapter 21, if you remember back to last week, when David gets to Ahimelech in Nob, I don't know if you remember what happened, but David lies to Ahimelech. David lies to Ahimelech that he was actually there on Saul's orders. Instead of, I'm fleeing from Saul, Saul wants me dead, David, to, calm the fears of Ahimelech, lies to Ahimelech and says, no, I'm only here because Saul sent me here. And so David lies to Ahimelech, leaving Ahimelech in the complete darkness in this situation. And so David here says, and I believe rightfully so, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. And so again, here's the additional layer on top of everything we've already talked about, that these events of Doeg's killing fulfilled. Not only that, but it brought consequence to David's lie. There was a direct, near immediate consequence to David lying to Ahimelech. And David knows this, and he understands this, and I believe repents from this. We've talked about this before, and I don't get into it here, but what's the difference between somebody like David and Saul? We've seen David sin a few times already. And obviously, as we know from his life, from his story, certainly won't be the last time. In fact, the sins that he's going to commit later, you could argue, are worse than what he did here. But what's the difference between someone like David and Saul is that David repents from those sins. David learns from those sins, and he uses these moments of sin and repentance to draw him closer to God, whereas Saul's sin is driving him farther from God. And so that's the big difference. That's why David can be called a man after God's own heart, and obviously somebody like Saul, the Lord had departed from him. And so, as we've seen, right, that their deaths, these priests and these other people mentioned in verse 19, these deaths were the fault of Saul and Doeg. They are 100% the sin of Saul and Doeg, unjustified actions. But they were also the fulfillment of the prophecy to Eli. It was also the just death of sinful people. But furthermore, it is also a direct consequence of David's lie. And so you have all of these events leading to this one singular, wicked, despicable action, and yet we at least partially understand why it happened. Now, none of these negate the other. If I was to say, well, the fact that David lied to Ahimelech and that leads to his death, it negates the sin of Saul and Doeg. No, it doesn't negate the Saul. They were still sin. They didn't know that David lied. They were still 100% sinful in their actions. David was 100% sinful in his actions, and yet God was 100% just to bring these actions and fulfill two different prophecies in doing so. And so I say none of these negate the other, and we need not worry about how in a world governed by a sovereign God. If we sit there and think, well, how can all these things be true at the same time? It's because we don't understand God. How can all of these things happen and God still remain holy and just? It's because we're not sovereign. We're not omniscient. We don't have, like I said, I think we can have a good understanding of this, but we certainly don't have a perfect understanding of it. And so we can see and rest and be comforted in the fact that if it happened because God is sovereign, because God is holy, because God is just. And like I said, was not taken by surprise by these events. And so this is, when we understand truly the sovereignty of God, it does tremendously comfort us in difficult passages such as this and many, many others, particularly in the Old Testament. Now, as the chapter ends here, David is committed to Abiathar, and you can imagine how committed he might be, considering himself to have been responsible for the death of his entire household. And he partially was, as we talked about. And so he tells in verse 23, "Abide thou with me, fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life, but with me thou shalt be in safeguard." And so David was committed to him. And again, interestingly enough, in another long line of contrasts, the author of Samuel here gives us another one, because the last word Abiathar heard Saul say was, "Thou shalt surely die, thou and all thy father's house." The last word to this point he has heard David say is, "With me thou shalt be in safeguard." Right? And so again, there's a very stark contrast between the actions of David and Saul regarding the priests. I want to read this quote here by Constable, because I think he does such a good job of kind of putting together this chapter in a cohesive way. He says, "Saul, the king, put himself before God. He became increasingly paranoid, isolated from others, hateful even toward his supporters as well as his enemies, and guilty of shedding innocent blood. David submitted to God's authority over him." But he goes on to say, his sins, including deceiving Ahimelech, bore bad consequences for himself and others. Nevertheless, God continued to bless and use David. And so he kind of summarizes all this here, and this is the part that I think is so good. "Therefore, we conclude that the most important issue is one of long-term authority, not incidental acts. Acts are important, but who is in control, God or self, is even more important." And here's what it means by this. Again, when somebody thinks, if somebody were just to mention to a Christian, what is your overall impression of King David? Most overwhelmingly so would give a positive impression. Right? He was a man after God's own heart. He was the greatest king Israel ever had. Israel was never as good as a nation as it was under David. David was the pinnacle of Israel's history, right? And so, most Christians would give an overall positive view of David, but also we acknowledge that there were these very bleak times where grievous. This is one of them. And so this is what Constable is talking about here when he say acts are important. They are. The individual actions of David did matter. David's lie to Ahimelech directly led to the slaughter of an entire house. Yes, there were other events taking place, but also that was a part of it. And so acts are important, but who is in control, God or self, is even more important. And so the point is that, yes, David had these individual moments of grievous sin, but the overall pattern of his life was being in submission to the will of God, was growing and maturing to the point he was more, I'll use the term Christ-like, than he was the day before. And the reason why this matters is because it should be the same for us individual Christians today. There are going to be acts. There are going to be moments of individual sin in our lives, right? John makes this abundantly clear. If you say you don't sin, you are a liar, right? There's no really way to get around it. And so there's going to be these individual actions, these individual moments of sin and wickedness in our life. How we respond to those and the overall pattern of our life matter more than those individual moments. Are we repentant? Are we moving beyond them? Are we becoming more Christ-like as a result of them? Are we allowing those actions to grow us instead of draw us farther away from God? And so, again, that's not to negate those moments. It's not to negate the seriousness of our sin and the consequences that may result from them. But that is to say that our lives are not defined by the singular actions. Our lives are defined by the overall pattern of our life. Are we making a more Christ-like a movement in our walk with Christ day by day, or the sins stacking up one after the other, and we're getting farther and farther from God instead of closer and closer to God? It's not just going to be a direct line. You know, if you're picturing a line graph, it's not just going to be a point here, point B, or point A here, point B here, and it's just a straight line up. There's going to be some dips. There's going to be some ups and downs. But overall, it should be moving up. And I don't want to, and I'll close by saying this, I don't want to give the impression that's by our strength, that's by our doing. We cannot do that outside of the grace and strength of God. And so we've got to be dependent upon Him. That's why Proverbs tell us, trust in the Lord. Right? Trust in the Lord. Acknowledge Him in all thy ways, and He shall direct thy path. And so we've got to acknowledge Christ. We've got to seek His grace. We've got to seek His strength, because we're certainly not doing it on our own. If we're relying on our own strength, it's going to be a downward spiral, kind of like what we're seeing in Saul. And so really important historical events, and mostly in chapter 22, but in this unit, I'll say, important historical events, things that were fulfilled, direct prophecies given by God, too, in fact, but also important moments just in the overall life of David, moving him towards being king, and all the things that we kind of think about when we think about the life of David. So we've got some more interesting stories coming up in Samuel, and as we move on into 2 Samuel, looking at the life of David. All right, let me pray.